For years, the world has viewed Ben Shephard and his wife Annie as one of television's most grounded, quietly brilliant couples. Ben, the charming, quick-witted, warm-hearted presenter beloved for Good Morning Britain, Tipping Point, and Ninja Warrior, has long been admired for something rare among modern TV personalities: grace without ego, humor without cruelty, success without arrogance. And Annie, his childhood sweetheart, known publicly far less than her husband, has always embodied something equally admirable: strength without spectacle, intelligence without the need for spotlight, and a level of emotional steadiness that people close to her describe as the glue of their family. Their marriage appeared unshakable. Their family life looked beautifully ordinary, and their dynamic seemed the perfect antidote to the high-pressure world of television. But what the public never saw, what Ben is only now beginning to open up about, is that behind that calm, polished exterior, a very different emotional reality was quietly unfolding. Ben's recent confession, shared hesitantly and with visible vulnerability, has left longtime fans stunned and deeply moved. Because for the first time in decades, Ben Shephard is admitting that the last few years pushed him further emotionally than anyone realized. He describes nights filled with frustration he didn't know how to articulate, moments of heavy silence between him and Annie that frightened him, and long stretches where the pressures of his expanding career began to erode the very certainty he'd always felt about the balance between his work and his home life. This is the story of a man many believed could handle anything, a man known for being calm, kind, patient, and unfailingly positive, a man who rarely breaks, finally admitting that he almost did. And this story begins long before the crisis. It begins with a truth Ben has never publicly said out loud, until now. Chapter 1: The Marriage Everyone Admired. From the outside, Ben and Annie looked like a rare kind of couple, two people who found each other before life complicated things, and somehow stayed perfectly aligned even as fame, family, and responsibility grew heavier. Ben's colleagues always described him with the same words: gentle, genuine, calm, never flustered. Producers joke that he has a firefighter's temperament, able to stay centered even when chaos erupts around him on live television. Viewers saw him as the one steady presence on morning TV, a man who could soften conflict, smooth awkward moments, and bring a sense of humanity to a world that often feels too fast, too loud. But what viewers didn't see, because Ben never said it, is that almost all of that calm came from the emotional security he gained from Annie. She wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor, his sounding board, his refuge. A woman who, despite avoiding the public eye, is known among friends as fiercely insightful, perceptive, and quietly resilient. It was this dynamic, his warm visibility, her private strength, that made their relationship feel so steady, until it wasn't. Chapter 2: The Pressure That Built Slowly. According to Ben, the cracks didn't arrive suddenly. They didn't explode into arguments. They didn't become tabloid headlines. They arrived quietly, in the kind of subtle shifts that only long-term couples notice. It began in the years when Ben's career evolved from busy to, as he puts it, relentless. Between GMB's demanding early hours, Tipping Point's filming schedule, special events, charity projects, and ITV expecting more and more from one of their most reliable presenters, Ben began living a life where he was either on air, preparing to go on air, or recovering from having been on air. And while Ben's work was expanding at a pace even he didn't predict, Annie's life was changing too. As the boys grew older and more independent, Annie stepped into professional and personal roles that demanded far more of her emotionally. She was juggling responsibilities no one outside their home ever saw. And this, Ben now admits, is where the emotional tension began to grow, because both of them were carrying more than they knew how to share. Chapter 3, When Silence Becomes a Language. This chapter of their marriage is the one Ben struggles most to talk about, because the truth, he says, is that it wasn't arguments that scared him. It was silence. Not the comfortable silence couples develop over decades. Not the shared quiet of sitting together, both lost in thought. This was a different kind of silence, the kind born from two people so emotionally drained that they no longer knew how to talk about what was hurting. Ben explains it like this: I wasn't shutting Annie out. I was shutting everything out. I just didn't realize she was on the other side of the door. There were evenings when he came home so exhausted that he didn't have the emotional bandwidth to be present. There were mornings when he left for work feeling guilty that he had nothing left to give. And there were weeks where Annie, carrying the emotional load of the household, felt quietly abandoned, even though Ben never intended to abandon anyone. The distance didn't come from a lack of love. It came from a lack of energy, a lack of clarity, a lack of communication, a lack of understanding of just how deeply the other person was struggling. But the real turning point, the moment Ben says he will never forget, was the conversation he didn't expect, at a moment he didn't foresee. Chapter 4, The Night Annie Finally Spoke. Ben recalls it vividly. He had just finished a particularly grueling stretch of early morning shows and a full week of tipping point filming. He came home late again, and Annie, usually so composed, so patient, so measured, looked at him with an expression he'd rarely seen in their decades together. The kind of sadness that comes after hope has been stretched thin. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse, she didn't traumatize. Instead, she asked a single question. Ben, are we still walking through life together? Because lately it feels like we're walking the same road, but not side by side. Ben says that sentence hit him with a kind of force he never expected from words spoken so quietly. It was then he realized he wasn't losing Annie. He was losing the version of himself that she fell in love with. And in that moment, something shifted. Because for the first time, Ben stopped trying to hold himself together and let himself admit he was falling apart. Chapter 5, Ben's Emotional Confession. In a rare display of vulnerability, one he normally saves for moments off camera, Ben finally opened up. Not as the polished presenter, not as the dependable professional, not as the calm presence everyone else expected him to be, but as a man who had been quietly overwhelmed for longer than he realized. He confessed that he'd been carrying guilt about not being present, fear of disappointing his family, pressure to be the steady one on TV and at home. And he said something that Annie later told him was the most honest moment of their marriage. I've spent so long trying to be someone people can rely on that I forgot to rely on you. Annie didn't cry. She didn't lecture. She didn't retreat. She reached for his hand and simply asked him what he needed. It was the first time in years Ben allowed himself to answer that question truthfully. Chapter 6. The Path Back to Each Other. Rebuilding didn't happen overnight. It didn't come with grand gestures or dramatic announcements. It didn't require a break, a separation, or a crisis so big it reached the public. What it required was something far more difficult: intentional closeness. Ben made changes to his work schedule, quietly, deliberately, without fanfare. He set boundaries he'd never allowed himself before. He began saying no to certain projects without feeling like he was letting the industry down. And Annie, who had spent years being the emotional foundation of their family, finally allowed herself to lean on him too.